about. So thank you for joining. I'm Sally Thornton for the 2 people who don't know me. And I run a company called Forshay, which is enabling people to do their best work on terms that work for their full life. So what that really means is recruiting, because you have to sort of figure out where you want to, what team you want to join, and cultural alignment and diversity inclusion are critical for me. And then interim, which is actually more recession proof, like interim employees. So it could be, we can't hire a full-time employee, but we need this project done. And then we do diversity and inclusion consulting, because we have to look at the system of work in order for recruiting to be successful. So we try to look at the whole ecosystem of how people do their best work and then enable it to actually happen. We're redoing our website so it better articulates that, but we're all works in progress, right? So, so I'm not going to do slides, which is unusual for me because I really like the visual learning, but I knew that part of the goal was that many of you might be outside, but since we're inside, if you want slides, I do have visuals for this because I've done this for another company. I'm going to give you sort of the condensed version. But essentially the visual I'd like you to imagine is how work, what Stanford calls leisure, I call oxygen mask first, and learning are throughout your whole life, right? So we start our lives with a lot of education, a little bit of work, quite a bit of oxygen mask first, you're playing, and then it shifts, right? And so the way in which we think about the science of work and well-being integrated is essentially that the thesis is actually quite clear that when we take care of ourselves, we do our best work. But the social science is that the more we work, the better we are evaluated. And so I try to look at the social science and the neuroscience to say what's actually true in work and well-being, and how do these things come together. So when we think about individual well-being and team well-being, the goal is that these things are actually mutually supportive instead of feeling zero-sum. So the zero-sum mindset is, like, to me, kind of like a crushes my soul. And actually the science is quite clear that when we sleep and exercise and take care of ourselves, that's not a distraction from work. It actually fuels our better work. So it's this virtuous cycle instead of feeling zero-sum. So that's kind of my thesis. And then I look for science to support it. I'm sure I could probably find some science that doesn't support it, but we're just going to focus on the science that supports it. So the way that I would love for you to also, use your imagination is to imagine like a superhero at work. And instead of that superhero being exhausted and like barely, they crossed the finish line and they, didn't have enough water, didn't have enough food, that instead well-being is, like, for me, the new superhero, and that boundaries actually are a good thing. So if you think about it too, it's kind of that, like, what we see at Stanford D School, the design school at Stanford, is about how design constraints actually fuel creativity. Raise your hand if you already know the D School, because I can at least do a quick poll. This is my favorite kind of poll. Okay. So Cecil, you gotta check out D School. Oh, you do know him? Okay. Oh, you don't know him? Okay. So design school at Stanford is what actually is about creativity, product innovation, and using empathy to inform design. And what they've shown is that when you have constraints, whether it's time or money, I don't know, think of another constraint, those are kind of the big ones I always think about, other resources, it could be hard resources, material resources, that actually those constraints can fuel different solutions than when you have all the time in the world and all the money in the world, it can be less creative. So anyway, so thinking about boundaries is actually a design constraint that fuels creativity and your well-being. That's what I want you to think about. Okay. So typically for this individual well-being, the biggest challenge is that we're yes people, right? So when someone asks for your help, you're like, yes, I will help. Yes, I want to help. And that's great. Except when the yeses exceed the capacity of what we can do, right? So one of the things I fall victim to often is the planning fallacy. In behavioral economics, we believe that certain things will take, X amount of time, and they typically take 3X, right? The amount of time. And so how do we combat this idea of wanting to be I don't want to say a pleaser, because it's not like you're subservient, but just like wanting to be supportive and of service and say yes when people ask you for help. So one of the things we've seen in the research is it's called the positive no. And the positive no goes back to the neuroscience. We have to think about two things, neuroscience and social science. So on the social science side, we want to be yes, we want to work really hard, yes, yes, yes. On the neuroscience side, if we hear a no, we actually go to the back of our brains. It's just sort of, it's unconscious, right? It just goes there. Like you say, no, I can't do that. And you're like, oh, it's like a threat. And so if you actually shift to this thing called the positive no, you can say, acknowledge, this is the way that they talk about it. Acknowledge the request with warmth. Share a positive priority of why there's something else that's positive that's also a priority. So you're introducing the fact that there might be some decisions that need to be made without yet saying the word no, right? And then end it with a different way of thinking about how we could solve the problem. So again, it doesn't feel binary. It doesn't feel like I just said no to you, because then that puts the person back in their amygdala. So consider that the way in which we create boundaries and the way in which we use neuroscience and social science is that there's still ways to say no without triggering people to feel like you're not that all-in awesome worker who wants to say yes. And so it's something to play with. I actually just recently learned about this, so I'm going to try it myself. I'm always looking for how boundaries can be heard, because a lot of times we have fantastic intentions for what we want to say in terms of priorities and work. But we don't often meet our expectations of ourselves of trying to say no in a really nice way. And so the other thing I would say is I'm working on this metacognition of thinking about how we think. And when we accidentally hit the back of our brain, right, which is defend and and basically like fight or flight, to the discovery part of our brain, which is where creativity is, and that's where we do our best work. And so we have to become a little bit more aware of this. And when I was talking about it the other day, one of the great things about reading this science and talking about it is it stays in my conscious more. And so I noticed the other day that when someone in my family said something about my cooking and the salt or whatever, that I was like, and I literally almost felt it in my brain. I was like, oh my gosh, I just went to my total defense mechanism, and I was going to, and by creating that metacognition, I was able to take a breath and then ask more of a clarifying question, like, tell me more, how are you thinking about this? And not be just responsive, right? And so we can do the same thing at work. When you start to feel yourself, this is where individual well-being and team well-being come together. How might we notice that when someone asks something of us or judges something that we've done, how do we take a pause and try and move it back from what the easiest way I like to do is bring new language into neuroscience, because no one's going to remember like amygdala and prefrontal cortex at work, but it's like defend or discover, right? We're either in defensive mode or we're in discovery mode. And for our well-being, we really want to live more here, and we have to actively move our brains to do that, because this is much easier. It doesn't take as much energy. Our brain loves living back here. It's exhausting to live up here. So we have to actively do that. And that's one thing I'd love for you to think about. One is just be aware of it. And then two is sort of try this positive no, that so you're not triggering someone else who's in the back of their brain. We're all works in progress, right? And feel free to ask me any questions or raise your hand. But since there's only a few of us, I would say, unless it's a private question, I would love for you to ask questions during the session. Okay. So the other thing I really love that's specifically for a pandemic, like I can't say that word without just feeling awkward and like I'm in a dystopian movie, but in the pandemic is how the brain connects to the body in the emotional regulation side. So typically we don't think about emotional regulation at work. We just think about getting stuff done, right? Well-being feels like, like that's fuzzy and it's not work. But the reality is, and this is what I love about Brené Brown's work, is if we don't attend to our emotions, it actually comes out in work, right? And it takes maybe like 5x time to deal with it versus if we attend to our emotions up front, it allows us to do our better work, right? Back to that virtuous cycle. So a couple strategies for emotional regulation is the name it to tame it. So if you're feeling anxious and you say, wow, I'm really feeling anxious, and you don't have to say it out loud to anyone who you may not want to know how you're feeling. You can write it down. You can say it to a trusted friend. But naming the emotion reduces the feeling of it, the intensity of it, because now your brain actually sees it. It's when you're kind of soupy about your emotions that it doesn't work. And so saying like, oh my God, I feel joyful, I feel stressed, I feel confused, all the feelings, the more we actually express these things, the more your brain kind of calms down because you've named it. And that just helps it deal with it better. The other is reframing. So if we just ignore it, growing up, we would joke that my mom was like rose-colored glasses and she would always see everything as positive. Like she was the reframing master. But we as kids were like, that's bullshit. Like she's not attending to like what's real and negative. And so it's a 1-2 punch. Like we have to say what's quote true for us and real and hard, and see the hard and recognize it before we can reframe it. Then you can go for the positive. And the reframing is a fantastic emotional regulation skill. You just can't skip step 1, right? So step 1, name it, see it, process it, feel it, right? And step 2 is now reframe. So David and I were talking just before you guys joined of like the reframe of what are the all good possible things that can come from this. And we were talking about even right before we started around like telework now, or remote work, or distributed teams, whatever language we love. No longer weird right now. Now it's fantastic and normative. And when things become normative, it's much less stressful. It's really hard to be in the outlier status because we're social animals, right? We like to do similar things and feel connected and like we're all in it together. And so being the outlier, when I first started Flexperience, that was hard. Okay, so name it, to tame it, and reframing. And then my favorite last one is positive distraction, which is just like how you would imagine like the shiny little bauble of like why we love to distract ourselves. And that works for kids, it works for adults, it's all good. Okay, so once you've done that, once you've sort of created some emotional regulation, the other thing that is really important is how things connect to the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system. And this is all automatic, but they call it autonomic, right? On the science side, it's autonomic, but what it is actually is your automatic ways. You're not consciously knowing when you're in your sympathetic nervous system or your parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic is the cortisol, I'm playing tennis, I'm, go, go, go. It can also be the stress of presenting, which although I don't really feel it right now, but that's the cortisol and the sympathetic nervous system. We tend to live in this more than we should. The parasympathetic nervous system is the rest and digest, right? It's where our metabolism works better. It's where our bodies are able to regenerate ourselves better, so we have less disease and age-related issues. So we actually need to move more consciously away from the sympathetic and into the parasympathetic because our bodies have not evolved as quickly as our modern society has. And now under pandemic, we are really living in our sympathetic nervous system. So to consciously shift, there's just a few things that are like the most accessible. One is deep breathing. And it can be as easy as just literally like putting your hand on your heart and on your belly, and especially with Elizabeth going to bed soon, just observing your breath starts to move your nervous system from your sympathetic to your parasympathetic. Laughter does it. So, obviously social media is alive with funny memes and, trying to make light of really hard situations, and it works. So that's where social media is good, right? Is like creating that laughter. And then the last one that's pretty common is cold exposure. And I grew up in Minnesota. I have Norwegian roots, but I still was very confused why people would jump into cold water, like on purpose. But it turns out like it's an antidepressant. It moves, your nervous system. Like there's so many positives. It boosts your metabolism. Like there's so many good reasons to it. Still don't like it. But you can do these little shortcuts. So one of my friends who was going through a really hard time, she had a bowl of water in her kitchen with ice, and she would put her face into it when her teen was stressing her out, and it totally worked. So however you want to do cold therapy. Someone else actually on my last webinar would put cold compress in the back of her neck. And so these are just really easy ways of not getting into a pool of cold water, to move yourself into the parasympathetic nervous system. And just make sure that you're doing it consciously, because the other thing we've seen in the research on sleep from Matthew Walker, who wrote that great book on sleep called Why We Sleep. He's a neuroscientist out of Cal. If you haven't seen his book, it's a must read. But what he talked about, and this is particularly true for women, Elizabeth, but for men and women, is we have to dump the cortisol during the day in order for us to sleep well at night. Meaning, if you ignore your well-being all day and you're like, boom, 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 I'm in my sympathetic nervous system, go, go, go. And then at night you're like, why am I not falling asleep? It helps you fall asleep better if you dump it throughout the day, and it helps you stay asleep. So what he showed, particularly back to the women, is in the middle of the night, more women would wake up because the cortisol was still processing because we haven't dumped it during the day. So really creating those spaces, and whether you want to put it, I always joke, like, if you really want to do it, put it on your calendar, right? Because we do things that are on our calendar, but we don't do things just because we happen to remember it. You could say, like, all right, for the Wellbeing seminar, this is going to be a time where I'm going to do the deep breathing. I'm going to dump that cortisol. These are all easy ways that don't take very long and obviously free. So that's kind of cool. Okay. So the other key thing I would say on the individual well-being that connects is around exercise. So raise your hand if you are exercising more than you did before the pandemic. Okay. Raise your hand if you want to be exercising more and you're not yet. Okay. So the science is essentially that our mood and our motivation goes up 41% when we exercise. So it's not just weight maintenance, which is a very American kind of focus on exercise. I actually realized that I wasn't as vain as I thought because when I did it for weight exercise, I was very inconsistent. But since I've learned the science of the emotional side of it, mood, right, and motivation, I do it every day. Like now it to me is like water. Like I have to have water and I have to exercise. And it's just scientifically like overwhelming evidence that it's going to help. And it doesn't, we all have different constraints. So I would just say play with it a bit, but consider it to be like water. Like you're going to fill up your water bottle and you're going to figure out when you're going to exercise and how much. My favorite hack is the 7-minute app. If you do the 7-minute app, it might be $1.99 on your phone. They do 30 seconds of high intensity, different kinds of exercises that equal a 45-minute run on your body because it's muscle confusion. So that was one I did when I traveled because it was 7 minutes and I could do it. At home now, I'm doing a lot of streaming stuff. So some of my friends are doing dance, some are doing yoga, and there's just a ton of things to do. The key is you need to sweat. So even when I'm doing yoga, I try to do the one that has more intensity. Because if you're not sweating, you're not triggering all of that beautiful brain chemistry that really, it makes you feel good, right? It's like a cocktail without all the bad stuff. Okay, so that's individual well-being highlights that I think are the most important in a pandemic. And then we think about how that comes into the team so that have that sort of healthy core to come into the team. The most important thing, and raise your hand if you already know about psychological safety. Okay, half. So psychological safety was pioneered by Dr. Amy Edmondson from Harvard. And she did it a long time ago. I mean, maybe 25 years. And only when Google was doing research around what is it about their high-performing teams, some teams versus another, they were trying to figure out what are the correlations. And the one thing they kept coming back to was psychological safety. Psychological safety basically means you feel comfortable to say a different opinion, to ask a question, to challenge the status quo. And if we don't create that in a team environment, we don't have that level of well-being, you end up having people covering up mistakes. You end up having people not share their great ideas because they don't feel safe. And so thinking now in a more distributed environment, and maybe even when you've always been distributed, how do you continue to fuel psychological safety? So one technique that my team does is on our Monday morning calls, we do just a quick check-in. So on our team calls, we only have 10 people, but I've been on team calls of 150. And then they would just do an emoticon in the chat. Like there's lots of different ways to check in depending on the size of the group. But if it's a size where you can say a word, you know, like I'm feeling stressed, or I'm feeling optimistic, or I'm feeling confused, right? It allows other people in the group at other times to reach back out to you and to kind of check in. It's sort of an invitation of like just allowing people to be their whole self on the team. Now in my team, we do a full 3-minute check-in because there's only 10 of us and we only have a call once a week. So it's a way for us to get grounded in the beginning of the week to say how we're feeling. We do a personal check-in and a professional check-in within that 3 minutes. So I might say, I'm really missing my daughter. She's in a school that's away because she's in a specific therapy that I can't support her with. So she's away and it's really, really hard on me and I'm feeling really sad. And, you know, and just so people know where I stand and they can, if I show up flat emotionally with them, they don't think it's them, right? Because as a CEO, if I show up flat with you and you're like, oh my God, what did I do? You know, why is she this way? And it's like, no, she has other issues going on, right? So first I do that, then I'll say what my priorities for the week are, and that's back to the load balancing. Because I might say, you know, hey, we're redoing our website. I could really use people's ideas for which blogs we should highlight or whatnot, so that we can load balance and talk about our priorities and goals for the week. So that's one way of creating psychological safety and load balancing, right? By doing check-ins. And I think when we gather physically, we can overlook these things. You know, you just sort of jump into a meeting and get going. You might say like, hey, how are you? But you don't really listen. And I think this is an opportunity for us to really mesh the individual well-being and the team well-being with some of these strategies that are, you know, absolutely scientifically proven for decades. The other thing I will say on the team well-being is to listen for silence. Because if there's just an extrovert just talking and you have a team and some people are just quiet, how might we use the chat function to bring out different ways that people might feel comfortable communicating, and how might we create space for me to ask a question and listen for an answer and be okay with that silence? Because there's good silence and then there's problematic silence. And so the other thing that we've been paying attention to is, in this shift, how do we pay attention to when the silence is productive and when the silence is problematic? Okay. So the other fun way that I try to mix individual well-being and team well-being is to have more walks and talks. So David and I, back when we could be closer than 6 feet apart, he would come to Lafayette and we would do a walk and talk around the Lafayette Reservoir. And it's a great way of connecting, and we can do that virtually, right? So as much as like Cecil was joking that he's on Zoom calls all day, you know, sometimes you could say like, hey, could we do this next one with video off and actually walk around our backyard or our neighborhood? And there's science on both sides that video sometimes has a positive effect socially, emotionally, and other times audio does. So the good news is you know, mixing them, right? Versus saying like being on video all day because that's the most connected. It's not always. In fact, back to, I like try to pay attention to the science that I like. I like audio calls because I like to walk around. And some of my team was pushing for video, and I said, all right, I will compromise and we'll do half and half. So 1 week we do audio, 1 week we do video, 1 week we do audio. So just for your own well-being, really think about which calls you don't need to look at a screen. You don't need to see people's physical reactions, because sometimes even listening to them can be a different way of tuning into people, right? Don't think of it as like less information. It's actually just different information. We process it differently. And I'm sure you guys are already doing like the virtual dinner parties and things like that, but knowing that social science and finding space to create that time is super important for our mental health. And the last thing I'd say is figuring out how we give back. So the science of individual and team well-being in ways that we can contribute to what the outcomes we want. is incredibly powerful. We know this is Yoel's mission. Why am I even saying that? Just join Yoel. Okay. So last one is about the power of story. So we all have stories that we tell ourselves, right? We're meaning makers in our head. And some of our stories serve us, right? Like it's a story of resilience. It's a story of growth. It's a story of love. And some of our stories don't serve us, right? Our brain is circling on something that's really negative. Our memories are not always the best. And so consider what your personal narrative is. Pay attention to that metacognition of thinking about how you think. And with the pandemic, think about the story you want to tell, right? How might we be intentional to say, what's my individual story during the pandemic and what's the team story during the pandemic? And what do I want it to be? Because we are authors of these stories. We're essentially, right, creating the idea of it. We're contributing to it. We're contributing to other people's stories. And so just creating a little intentionality. This time in our lives, we were, Dave and I were talking about our teen children, like this is going to be like a formative time for all of us, but especially for younger people. And what's the story? What's the sense they're going to make of it? There's already a beginning. We're in part of it. There will be an end, right? And so the more we can help them see the through line, the more we can help them navigate it, and the more we can articulate it for ourselves and create sense out of hard things. I mean, that's actually where meaning is made, right? So unfortunately, the easy stuff we forget. And it's the hard things that can really drive meaning. So that would be my last thing to consider for yourself is, where do I want to contribute to this story? And which stories are circling in my head that don't serve me? And then think about that again, individual and team, and where these things come together, because that's actually our lives. Our lives are very intermixed. And, we used to say like, some things are professional and some things are personal, but that Venn diagram of what overlaps is becoming more and more clear, and sort of recognizing that humanity in a way that doesn't feel like people have to show up in anything that's not their authentic self, right? I think is one thing that's going to be a good outcome of the story. So, questions?
Yes. The bullet point before you introduced the parasympathetic versus sympathetic. I couldn't capture it, and I couldn't connect it to the other things that you said before that.
So before parasympathetic and sympathetic was the emotional regulation on naming it to tame it, reframing, and positive distraction.
That's it. Positive distraction. So tell me what positive distraction is. You mentioned a bobble, but
yes. I went too fast. Thank you. Wow, I'm so impressed with your note taking. Okay, so positive distraction is something that when we've had toddlers, we know that like if they really, really want something, the easiest thing is to be like, instead of fighting them for that thing, is to say like, oh, did you see the dog? And suddenly the toddler like forgets all about whatever he or she was fighting for and looks at the dog. So it's the same idea of if your brain is really in a hard place, right? So let's say I'm really worried about my daughter and I'm just kind of like stuck there. It's about, again, naming it to tame it, right? And reframing it, but then saying like, what is something that I can just like shift my thinking entirely? So maybe I'm going to go cook, right? Or maybe I'm going to go for a walk, or maybe I'm going to call my best friend and like, just say, tell me a joke, right? It is literally totally distancing yourself from it. So again, not because you've ignored it. So first thing is seeing it, feeling it, but not staying there. And that's where positive distraction comes in, which is like after you've seen it, felt it, now how might we distract our brains and think about something else and not just stay there? Because there is what they call in therapy sort of like overthinking it. Like you need to think about it, but you can stay there too long. And that's where positive distraction is the way to get out. And literally I do it physically. Like when things get really rough for me, I walk out the door, just like this feeling of like freedom. And I say the gratefulness stuff that I know will give me my serotonin boost. I'll like, God, it was trees are gorgeous. I'm so grateful that I live in California. Or I'll just start this gratefulness thing to totally distract my brain because I just can't stay there, right? Yeah.
So in my experience, that comes in really handy when wrestling with a problem you're trying to solve, and it's basically it's moving it to the background so that innovation can happen.
100%. It's a great business example. And in fact, Patty McCord, who's used to be the head of HR at Netflix, she joked that she wanted to put in showers at Netflix just so people could distract their brains. Because you know how you come up with these great ideas in the shower? It's like, once you move your brain into like back to the autonomic part, you know, it's like, oh, I'm just showering or whatever. Then these ideas come, right? It's literally because you're just changing your brain thinking, and then it takes away that noise. So it's the same idea on the emotional side, right? Yeah, good analogy. And we all should shower more. Probably in the pandemic, like 3 times as much. Any other questions? Otherwise, I'd love to hear, oh, I see that, a 30-second exercise. There's one question. What was the 30-second exercise? Okay, it's the 7-minute app, which I think I downloaded it when it was like really, really early days. So I don't know that my 7-minute app is your 7-minute app, but it looks like this. It's literally just a 7, and it's called the 7-minute app. And you basically do like 30 seconds of push-ups, 30 seconds of jumping jacks, and it'll tell you what to do and to switch. What's great about it is you don't need a gym. All you need is a chair, because you do like tricep push-ups and like step-ups on a chair. I think that's all you need. You don't even need shoes. Like, it's fantastic. I do it quite a bit. And it's hard at first if you've never done it. And then as I did it more, I would be super bored by 7 minutes, and I would do it twice. So some people say like, only 7 minutes. I'm like, fine, do it twice and tell me how it goes. No one wants to do it twice again. Like, it's hard. It's a good workout. Yeah.
So obviously this talk was, there we go. There's a good image. Was catered to the current situation, but I'm curious if there was anything you would add if you were just giving this in a normal setting.
I know. What is normal, right? So yeah, it's so I do have a talk for free on YouTube that I did it's a organization called Women in Product. But if you just type in my name, Sally Thornton, and I think into Google, it's so embarrassing. If you just Google Sally Thornton, there's a talk where I do basically the science of work-life blend in 45 minutes. Mm-hmm. And it's all the hacks that I've been practicing myself that are the combination of individual. I don't do as much team well-being in that one because it's only 45 minutes, but I touch on it. But yeah, that has 45 minutes, and you can do it anytime. You don't have to wait till it's 10 p.m. London time. Other questions? Yes, the 7-minute workout is high intensity interval training. That's exactly what it is. Okay, if you don't have questions, I'm curious in the few minutes we have left, what you're most optimistic about. Like, let's use this time, just a few minutes, to talk about, and unmute please, because there's not too many of us. What are you optimistic about, and what are you concerned about, and how might we just as a small tribe support each other?
Let's see. I guess I'll start off. There's a few things that come to mind. One thing, I was surprised at how many of these practices, even though I'm not familiar with a lot of these, that I'm intuitively doing with my team already. Mm-hmm. So that's encouraging, because I go, hey, look, I'm not a dope. I know some stuff. And then, so what am I most optimistic about? One of the good things, I'll separate it into business and personal. Mm-hmm. On the personal side, of course, the forced being together with your nuclear family or partners or whoever you live with is kind of, I think that's been very positive, because you realize we don't really spend all that much time together. Mm-hmm. It's an hour in the morning and then maybe a few hours in the evening before bed. But there's not a whole lot of interaction time. And so being able to having this forced time is I think revealing either the quality of the relationships or where you could work on them more.
Yeah.
I think on the business side, what I'm most optimistic about is I work with small businesses, entrepreneurs, and I feel like we live in a world that is hyper focused on the Googles and the Facebooks and the Apples of the world. It's all about big business, and big business is controlling our lives. But I feel like this pandemic has revealed how critically important small and medium-sized businesses are, and how that and how they really make up what our lives are all about.
Mm-hmm.
And so and that's not to diminish Facebook and Google. We rely on those in our daily lives as well. But it's been I'm really optimistic that people will start looking at small business differently, and giving small business the recognition that they deserve, being the employers of well over 70, closer to 80% of Americans, that our leaders will start acting differently. And I guess if I'm challenged about something, I mean, I have to admit that I do worry about the new normal, and how many people may not have the time to pivot, and will create elongated economic hardships for people.
Yeah. And some of those big stuff, thank you, Cecil. It's so good to see your face. Some of that big stuff, you can time box it. You can say like, all right, I want to think about social, political issues in my community, in my country, in the world. I want to debate with someone who helps me further my thinking. And then I'm going to time box it, right? So when I called my parents last night to check on them because they're older and cannot leave the house for all the right reasons, my mom was going on about politics, and I said, Mom, I was like, right now I can't solve on politics. Like, I already listened to my NPR headlines, and like, I love you. Can we talk about something else? And she was like, totally. It's just like, it's creating that space to say, it's not that I'm an uninvolved citizen, but how do we ask these important questions, create space for it, but also time box it, right? So that we have the energy to continue to support the things that you're already doing, right? So I love that. And in the concerns, and not staying there too long, because there's a lot of stuff. Anyone else?
I'd love to there. So I've got 2 young ones, and they're old enough to understand the impact of what's happening. And so my optimism lies around hopefully their resilience to understand what can be different, and whether or not they box the what is normal now and what the new normal is. I'm really, really optimistic that they will not stand for some of the things that we've had to face, and will be definitely the leaders of change. What I'm most worried about is, to echo Cecil's comments, the hardships that many societies and communities are facing, especially poverty-stricken, and it's just highlighting the health disparities, economic disparities even more so. So I'm just hoping that, along with the worry, that paired with the optimism, that we can help support communities in that way, and rise up to that challenge in a collective effort.
I love that. I feel the same. I have a group in my company that focuses on diversity and inclusion, and they focus on not just, they joke, like, people put in the box of social justice warrior, and they're like, no, we're about like within business figuring out where the win-win-win is. But certainly some of the data coming out about how it is, impacting people of color and socioeconomic, hardship, and people who, don't have good health care coverage. I mean, it is dramatically not fair. And I think the more that story is being told, especially to the next generation, I think all generations, but I do feel like the younger generation generally feels like they're on fire and they can change things. where sometimes my parents are like, I don't know, you guys figure that out. So I do think there's a lot to be optimistic there. Anyone else?
I'll go.
Yeah.
I'm most optimistic at a broad level that there's no pollution over in LA right now, and that I feel bad for the folks that are working in the oil industry, but I think this is a really unique time where we can really make a change with, to what I think is the biggest problem facing my kids, which is climate change. And so I'm super excited that, this is the wake up call that nature is saying, fix me. I'm optimistic as well about seeing my kids be so resilient. I have a high anxiety daughter. Sorry about that, you guys. And just watching her respond to this, and I know how stressful it is really healing to me and makes me feel great. I'm most worried about personally elderly parents. I've got a mom who's 80 by herself at a senior living community on the East Coast, and I think about that constantly. And then like Cecil and Elizabeth, I'm also concerned about the inequity and whether our government is capable of taking care of those that need help right now, just operationally.
Right.
And so
I hear you. Thank you for sharing. I saw that from a prior one about your mom, and it, there's so much facing us. In fact, one of the conversations I had with this Stanford group back to the diversity inclusion was, how do we measure performance during COVID, right? So like Cecil, a lot of my clients are big, and they're trying to figure out, like, because they have these calibration sessions, and then their ranking changes their bonus or their salary increases, and it's like, what are you going to say? Like, Elizabeth's not an amazing worker because she's got 2 kids at home and she's trying to figure it out, or David's, managing an elderly parent and stressed out about that and not able to do work as normal. It's a really complicated conversation to figure out how our individual well-being shows up at work, and then how we're judged for it. So that's another thing I would leave you with, is to consider and question with your teams and with your friends and with your family, like, how are we supporting each other, and how do we, as much as possible, judge in new ways, like decide in new ways what good performance looks like, what impact looks like, because it's very circular.
Fascinating you bring that up. Yesterday, I had a conversation with a C-level executive at a large Bay Area firm that we all know. And that was paramount in the mind of an executive, is not necessarily people's well-being, but how am I going to measure productivity? Can I be sure they're not goofing off? And it was a little disheartening, but also I think an opportunity to try to link. I think the work that you do, Sally, is so important, because we need to figure out how to train executives on the link between empathy, well-being, and productivity. I find that my biggest problem with my team is getting them to stop working, not getting them to work.
Yes.
Actually, by giving them, the freedom and caring about their well-being first. Right. They tend to, in my experience, is people drive them a lot harder than I would drive themselves a lot harder than I would drive them if I were taking kind of that micromanaging totalitarian approach.
Right. And it's definitely what we see in any of the professional jobs, right? So it obviously the economy is very complex, but in terms of, the jobs that are professional services like mine, or the tech companies and the biotech companies, like, they do have to think about this, and they typically have employees who are the yes people, right? And are working all the time and pushing themselves really hard. And then the expectations that they have of themselves before and now are like, you don't change your identity just because of a pandemic, right? So we have these identities, and then we have like reality, and there's a lot there that needs reconciliation. Yeah. Anything else? Okay. Any closing words anyone wants to say? All right, then since we have 2 minutes and Elizabeth has to go to bed, let's just.
I had a closing sentence.
Good.
Something that I just want all of you to think about, and feel free to email me. We don't have time to discuss it here. But something that has been on my mind for a while is how we sometimes give some organizations, I think, a pass on caring about our environment and our world, and how the consumer dollar can really have a big impact. But my thinking may be off, so I would love this group to think about this. So one of the things that I've noticed since the pandemic started and shelter in place started is that Amazon is in my neighborhood every day to multiple houses. And by the statistics I've seen, even though Amazon may get up to the point where they're employing about 100,000 people, the estimates that I've seen is that they're displacing, through shutting down Main Street America businesses, millions of workers. And in addition to that, the old distribution center system that seems so flawed, of taking big ships, and the big ships translate to trains, trains to trucks, trucks to distribution centers, and then while we're out running our errands, we run by Target or wherever and pick it up. But instead now, instead of taking it to the store and putting it on a shelf, we take every individual widget, wrap it in plastic, put it in an individual box, and then we drive it to people's doorsteps. My analytical mind says that has to be horrible for the environment. The tires, the paint, the vehicles, the fumes they spew. You know, because I still go to the gym and work and stop off at the store on the way home. So it's not like I'm not driving less because I'm shopping. How is it that this potential environmental impact and the negative economic impact isn't more of a conversation? Or is there some positive offset that I'm completely missing? And we don't have time to answer that now, but I would love to hear from you all on this particular thing. And you can email me or find me on LinkedIn, but I would love some bigger brains than mine to say, Cecil, you've got it all wrong. You're missing A, B, C, D, E, F, and G.
David, I see you.
We're just saying you don't have it all wrong, Cecil.
But why isn't NPR calling them out? That's what
Yeah. Well, a future session then, David, requested by Cecil. Yeah. And the world.
Thank you so much, Sally. That was really terrific.
Yay. I just want to say, join us tomorrow. We're going to have Yale Director of Learning, Dr. Zanette Johnson, who's going to be talking about authenticity. And thank you for having me, David. And for all of you for joining.
Thank you. And if someone can, Sally, if you can send me that link for tomorrow, I just kind of accidentally came across this today. So
I will shoot it to you, Cecil.
That'd be great.
I will. Can you put your email address in the chat box?
I will be happy to do that.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. It was terrific.
Thank you.
Thank you. Elizabeth, I hope you sleep well. Do a little breathing before bed.
I'm going to do some cortisol dumping. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.